Welcome to the Playwright Python Masterclass. Last year I created the Playwright Masterclass for the JavaScript testing library. It was based on the 1.3 version of Playwright. In the comments, Daddy Eddie asked me to create a Python Playwright Masterclass. This one's for you, Daddy Eddie. Subscribe to get future updates on Playwright because it's constantly updating. I've tagged sections below if you want to skip ahead, but I would suggest watching the whole video. There's a lot of tips throughout the whole video that will build on each other later. So what is Playwright? Playwright's a browser automation package with multiple language bindings. You have Python, JavaScript, C#, and Java. Those are the main officially supported packages. There's also some other ones like Ruby that are unofficially supported, but still work. But today we're focusing on Python and all the Python features. All the bindings have a pretty similar parity, but the JavaScript is generally ahead. There's no guarantees when updates are coming through, but generally they come quick after a JavaScript package gets them. Playwright runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux. If you have any questions about Linux, look at the documentation for supported Linux distros. Playwright in general is written for browser automation. You can use the library with regular Python code, asynchronous Python code, or in Pytest. I'm using Pytest today because it does some of the dirty work for you, but you're more than welcome to use the library in your own code for whatever reasons you would like to automate a browser. It basically gives you full access to the browser and all the code inside the browser. The team at Playwright submits code back to Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit. They also unit test against all the browsers to keep compatibility. In general, the Playwright browsers you're testing with are the bleeding edge browsers. The idea is that you'd rather find a regression before the browser releases than after the browser releases. So these are the instructions we're going to use to get started with Playwright with Pytest. You're going to run the pip command at your terminal. Then we're going to create a test file that looks like definition with our Playwright code that we'll get into in just a second. And then we're going to run these from the command line using the Pytest command. So what this installation will actually do is it's actually going to install the Playwright browsers in the Playwright package. Once you have the package installed, you just type Playwright install, and it'll make sure you have the browsers installed. I've already installed them, so it didn't do much. So we're going to start out with a clean directory. Opening Visual Studio Code in this directory, you'll see I don't have any files. We started here by creating a file, test_file.py, and this is really important because in Pytest, it's going to be looking for your files that start with test. Just grabbing the sample code here, we're just going to paste that in just to make sure everything's set up properly. So I'm going to open up the terminal here and just type in Pytest. The first time it runs slow because it pulls in your PyCache, but you can see here that it found my one file and it ran my one test. And because I have this one green dot here, everything worked. And you can see it passed in 6.9 seconds. Rerunning the test, it runs in 1.98 seconds because it didn't have to read down all those packages. And obviously it's running headlessly because nothing showed up on the screen, but what if I wanted to see what was going on? If you just run Pytest with the headed parameter, all of a sudden you see Chrome pop up, it runs the test, and then it goes away. Chrome's the default, but what if I don't want to use Chrome? What if I want to use Firefox? I can use Pytest, still with the headed parameter. I can then go to browser. So here I'm going to run with Firefox in the headed mode as well. Flashes up, we see Firefox, and it finishes and it goes away. We can do the same thing with Firefox headless. We also have the possibility of using WebKit. Here we can see that WebKit ran headlessly in 2.5 seconds, and we can also run it headed as well. So no matter which browser you're doing, you can always use edit, headless, or any of the other parameters that we're going to set today. You actually also have the possibility of using multiple browsers. Here I've set browsers WebKit, Headit, and browsers Chromium. Doesn't really matter which order you put the parameters. But now we're going to see Chromium, WebKit. So we saw WebKit, we saw Chromium, and they were both headed. They both passed, all in one test run. We didn't have to write multiple tests. All we need is one single test, and it runs on multiple browsers. We're starting to throw a bunch of commands in the command line. The only one we really want to be running is Pytest, because we just want to be able to kick off our tests and have everything configured the way we like it. Luckily, there's an easy solution. We want to create a Pytest INI. So in this Pytest INI, what you really want is you want to start with the square brackets Pytest, and then use addopts equals, and then your parameters. So any parameters you want to run at your command line, you just run here. Now here, if we go back and just run Pytest again, it'll run on 2 browsers instead of the one it ran on last time. So what if you wanted to run on all browsers, but you wrote a test that just didn't work great on one? Let's pretend the test we're writing doesn't work well on Firefox. What would we do? Pytest actually gives us something pretty cool, and we can decorate with this Pytest mark skip browser, and you can just name the browser you want to script. We're getting this yellow squiggle here, but it's easy to fix. All we actually have to do is import Pytest, and then that'll work. So here you can see I updated my Pytest ini again with Chromium, WebKit, and Firefox. So theoretically, I should have 3 tests being kicked off, and I'm running it ahead so you can see what happened. Now this time it collected the 3 tests, being the 3 browsers. I got 2 green dots and 1 yellow S, or skipped. So it makes it really easy for you to control what browsers are being done without having to name a browser per test. And I'm just going to copy my test here for a second. So with this copy of the test, we want to do something different. Rather than skipping one browser, we want this one only to run in one browser. So now instead we should have 4 tests running. Do that again. Now we have 6 items collected, but we got 3 skipped. So this makes it really easy to only run your tests where they need to be going. So if you have a special use case in WebKit, you can run it there. And all this is great, but this console reporter is kind of difficult, especially when you get a lot of items. It's not the best experience because here you can see I have 6 items, 3 passed, 3 failed, but you don't really know which is which. You can't see much here other than it took 3.8 seconds for 3 passes. Because we're using Pytest, we can actually use a package to get a better reporter. Now that we installed the Pytest reporter, we're going to tell it which template we want to use, this HTML1 index HTML, and then we're going to tell it where we want the report to go. And we're going to tell it report HTML. Rerunning our tests, we're going to still get the same 6 items, 3 passed, but then it wrote our HTML report. If we open it up in a browser, we get the same thing with the duration, the total runtime. But if we expand this, we can see which tests have passed, which ones have failed, and we even get more information here about call setup and kind of all this other stuff going on. And once again, you're free to put those commands inside of this Pytest ini. Just keep it on the same line, save it. Jumping back over to our tests, I'm going to get rid of this test. Let's take a look at this test we wrote earlier. We have a test name. We're telling Playwright where to go to this https example.com. We're then telling it to look for the inner text on an H1 and make sure it's equal to example domain. Then we have a test name. We're telling Playwright where to go to this https example.com. We're then telling it to look for the inner text on an H1 and make sure it's equal to example domain. Clicking on something that says more information that's based on the text. Here we're setting up the URL we want to reach. This is actually more of a problem when you're hitting multiple environments because you don't really want to tell your tests every time where you're going. You would rather that be configured somewhere else. And there's an easy way to do that. So if I just change this to a slash, my test will fail when I run it. What you can do is you can send in the base URL as a command. And now the tests are working again. Of course, it's going to be better if we place that in here. And again, we have our tests working with the relative path now. Let's go a little bit deeper on these actions that we have. And to do that, we're going to need a little bit more complicated of a page. Example.com is great, but we can do a lot better for automating tests. What we want to use is the UI test automation playground. What's great about this website is there's a lot of tests here for simple things like client-side delay. You can press a button and have it load, and then eventually, after 15 seconds, there's going to be some stuff execute on the screen so that you can check to make sure your tests work properly with the client-side delay, which is usually a place where testing frameworks struggle. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but we're going to show why Playwright's awesome here in a second. We're going to use a test like this. And then you can also see they have ones like dynamic IDs where you would click on a button with a dynamic ID. You can do some stuff with text input, load delays. This one, it's the URL you're navigating from is slow, and then even the button appears after a delay on the page. So there's a lot of scenarios here that you can use with testing frameworks. You don't have to use this page with Playwright. If you use this with other testing frameworks besides Playwright, you're going to see how much more difficult it is to use those frameworks. So it's just a really good way to test out a new framework. They also give you a sample app here so you can test doing a login workflow and just see what that would look like. We're going to go through a couple examples here. Jumping back over to our tests, I'm just going to comment this one out here. First thing you have to do is you have to name your test. When you name your actual test, it needs to start like test as well. You can either start like test scroll bars, or you can end with scroll bars test. You can use either of those, and Pytest will find it. But if you didn't have this underscore here, Pytest would not find it at all. And then we're going to let Pytest inject this page, and we'll talk about that later of where this page is coming from. But this is actually Playwright getting its page injected by Pytest. So again, we're going to go to the relative path here of the UI testing playground, and we have two options here. We could actually navigate straight into scroll bars by using its URL, but let's use a click command to do that instead. So on the page, we're going to click, and since we're changing the page, let's also go into our Pytest ini and make sure we update our URL, update that base URL here. And with that base URL updated, we're just going to make sure that we can make it to our page now. But we were able to click through and get to the text scroll bars. So it's getting into this page. And now what we want to do is we want to be able to click on this button. So back in the test, you can see that we have a selector based off the text, and it's looking for text equal to scroll bars. So we could do the same thing with hiding button. Let's use the dev tools. And in the dev tools, when we look at those, we can see that there's other stuff here besides just the text. This is probably the only button on the page. So let's go ahead and just use the class button, or we can actually use the ID here of hiding button. So I'm just going to copy that. So it's going to look very similar to the previous click, except for now we're going to use the CSS selector. And now, without doing anything with these scroll bars, it's going to be able to actually run this test. And it happened extremely quick, but it was able to navigate to the page, scroll to where those needed to be, and then click on that button. But what happened? We didn't have to wait for anything. Things just kind of showed up. We didn't have to wait for the page to go. We didn't have to wait for the page to load. We didn't have to go anywhere on the scroll bars. How'd all that happen? Well, luckily, Playwright gives us this auto-waiting feature, so they do a lot of checks on the elements for us. That way we don't have to build a framework to do all these things every time we want to start a new set of tests. So here you can see, like on click, they'll check to make sure the element's attached. They'll make sure it's visible, stable, receives events, and is enabled. So they'll actually go out and look for it for us so that we can click on it. You can see here other actions that already exist, like check for checkbox, double click. You can tap, uncheck, hover, scroll into view if needed. Click already does that for you. It'll scroll where it needs to go. Fill for input boxes, select text. So let's write our next test. We're going to use this client-side delay as our next test. Just to make it interesting, we're going to use the URL as client-side delay. We'll avoid doing one click just for this test. And looking at the button, let's just grab the button primary class to show how the class selector works. So now what we're doing is we're going to the client delay page, clicking button primary, and now we're going to wait to see this text here, and we're just going to click on it for now to verify that it exists. And just for now, just to prove that it's all working, we're just going to do again this click. Let's reduce the amount of browsers in our test for right now. So now we're only hitting Chromium, and because this test is going to take 15 seconds, I don't want to wait for 3 browsers to do it. We're waiting the 15 seconds. Speed ahead for you guys. And it was able to click that text when it came up. So again, we didn't have to do any delays, task waits, or sleeps. We're able to just go ahead and just write our tests as a human would read it, and it's able to do those waits for us. There's a default timeout of 30 seconds, and you're able to configure that as well. Generally, 30 seconds is more than enough time for most websites. That was our second test, so let's go ahead and try to do a login. So again, we're going to navigate to the root of the page. We're going to click on the sample app link. And then we want to fill in this box. We look at the developer tools. We have a form control with a type of text and a placeholder of username. We have an ID that's a GUID that's probably not too helpful, and we have another attribute that's their name that's a username. So let's use placeholder username as our attribute. All right, so at this point in our app, we're into our sample app. So to do that, I'm gonna use a fill command. Instead of a click, we're gonna fill in this field. And if you look at the fill command, it takes a selector and then a value. Placeholder username is going to be our selector. We're going to use a special selector, being that's in square brackets, so you can find that attribute. So we're going to find placeholder and then make sure it's in double quotes or a string, and since it has a space. And then we're just going to send the string Bob to get filled out. I'm just going to comment out this test because I don't really want it to wait 15 seconds. So here now we're going to start. We're going to run our first test and our second test, and both are passing. And right now you're just trusting me that both are passing because they're going so fast. We're going to prove that in the next section. Right now what we want to do is see if we can speed up writing these tests by actually just generating. By default, Playwright actually gives you a code generator. I'm just going to use the terminal to do this right now. You can use Playwright Codegen, and then you can pass it your URL for your page. You don't have to give it one. It'll just speed up writing your tests. And if you spell Codegen correctly, it might work a little bit better. So here you can see it opened up the Playwright Codegen page for us, and every time I hover over anything, it's highlighting it in red, so you can see what it would actually click on if I would click right now. Over here, what's actually cool is if I open up this box, make it a little bit bigger, and then enlarge it for you guys, you can see that there's some code written over here. And anytime I click on anything, like scroll bars, it automatically adds code to this test. And you can see right here that there's a target of Python. So if I didn't want to write Python and wanted to write C#, Java, or JavaScript, it would actually convert these immediately over to those languages. But we're working with Python today. And even Python async is here as well, so you can see what it would look like if you wanted to write a program with just the asyncio. Everything looks a lot like our tests. They're actually doing it with the standard Playwright library just written in Python, which doesn't have our nice features that Pytest gives us. But we really start our test here and then have these functions right here. So it's generated all of this for us, and if we go ahead and here, scroll to where we want to be and click here, it's basically added the same test for us that we already wrote. We go back to our test file and compare really quickly. We can see there's a go-to, we've got a base URL, got our text of scroll bars here. Then it's also clicking on that button, and the generator really prefers text over IDs. And depending on how you write code, you might want to update those with your own selectors. But it does give you the frame of a test very quickly here. So if I don't stop my recording and go ahead and hit the back page, and let's go over here to the sample app. Again, we'll type in Bob, and then we'll type in test, and then we'll just click login here. It says here for successful test, I actually have to type PWD, so I'll just do it again really quick, just to show you how this generator works. And then we have welcome Bob here. So I don't think I actually finished this test, but what we can do over here is we can see that almost exactly like our test, we have page press username. There's a lot of stuff in here besides what we actually need, because I was tabbing, I was clicking, and I was also filling. But you can see we went to the login page, which took us back to the home page. We went back to the sample app that we were writing in our test. It clicked on the username, kind of like we did here with our fill. Started to put in Bob. I tabbed, which you can do here with a press tab. And then it also does a fill, and then it found this placeholder of this. And what I'm actually going to do here is just copy this and paste this over into my test, because this is what we're going to want to do. And then we're also, to prove it works, we're going to want to make sure that this exists as well, this welcome Bob. We could change this here to something else, but this will work for us here. So now to prove it, we can just run Pytest again, and we've basically written a test without having to click through, find selectors, and do all that. And I made a mistake because I actually forgot a step. We forgot to click on the text of login. And here you can see that that's, again, button primary or an ID of login. So we're going to, instead of using the button, we're going to use the ID of login. I always prefer IDs over text because Generally in the sites I test, the text will change fairly often, but the IDs usually stay constant. Testing with this, I found that when I just ran the fill on this page, it didn't work. Generally, on most pages, when you run the fill, you don't need to click into it to make it selected first. Specifically on this test page, I had to do this. So we had to click into the username to fill the username. In my experience in the past, I haven't had to do that with most of my apps. But then we press tab here just to test a different scenario, filled in the placeholder with PWD, we click the login, and then the welcome Bob came up on the screen. So here, this is more of a significant test. Again, things are happening so fast, it's hard to tell what's going on. And the one last thing I want to show you in generating these tests is if we stop the record, we can actually explore here to see what's going to get selected. So when we hover over Bob here, we can see that it's looking for this based on the placeholder of username, just like we used. This one's using that placeholder with some stars. This is now looking for text. You can see when we get down here, it's starting to use some other selectors. What's actually cool is the same website has some resources. And in the resources, you can see things like where do flaky tests come from? And then they also have DevHints.io here. And one of the cool things in this DevHints.io is this XPath. So you can see an XPath cheat sheet. So if you don't know these selectors off the top of your head, this DevHints page actually tells you that this is for IDs, this is for classes, this is an input with a submit, and you can now also see these XPath selectors here. This really gives you a leg up if you're just starting to write tests of how to use selectors. And the great news about Playwright is both XPaths and these attribute selectors are all supported. The text selectors are special. You don't have to text match like this because Playwright gives you the other text one that we've been using already. You can also come out here and look to see what selectors are available and see that they have things like nth element, Vue, and React, and possibly by the time you get here, they'll have new ones that aren't available right now in version 119. So being able to generate code's cool. What's even cooler is their trace viewer. There's two versions of the trace viewer. There's the local version that you can open traces with from the command line, and then there's their website where you can literally drop a trace file right here. You basically use this website like it's the command line version. It's up to you which one you like to do, but if your CI process stores the traces somewhere, you're then able to drop them here without installing anything else on your machine. It doesn't upload anything to the internet. It's all running as a progressive web app on your local machine. So it's safe. Again, right here, it doesn't upload your traces anywhere. It's only opening locally on your browser, but if you don't want to trust it, you can open the Node app from the command line. When you run Playwright help, you can see that Codegen's here. You can also see that in show trace, you have an option and you can pass it your trace file. If you've been with me for this long, you'll see that Playwright and Pytest make tracing just about as easy as everything else we've done so far. There's a prompt here for tracing, and by default it's off. Otherwise, we can turn it on or only retain on failure. If we want to control where the output goes, we can pass the output parameter, and by default, it's going to go to test results, which is fine for me. So let's turn tracing on here and see how it goes. All right, so in Visual Studio Code, we're going to type Pytest tracing on. Now we have a test results folder with some traces in them, and there's zips. I'm just going to open the trace viewer website rather than opening the Node app because it's simpler. And then I'm just going to grab one of my traces here. I'm going to grab the one for the login trace. And now you can see the app. Again, this is the progressive web app that's going to do tracing. Across the top, you can see there's like a time lapse of what's going on. And if I hover over it, you can see what the screen looks like at that time of the test. So about 500 milliseconds, the page loads. You can see around here, the icon finally loads. And then here, you can see it scrolls down to find sample app. And then over here, and again, across the left side, you can see as I scroll across, you can see which step it's on. And we'll just get to that in a second, but that's how the timeline works if you ever want to use it. It's not super helpful, but it's kind of cool. So here, again, you can see that now if I go down to like page click, I can click on it. I can see where Playwright has clicked with this red dot. Let's do it again here on this page fill. Page press here, that was a tab, so that one didn't select anything. On page click, you can see somehow it clicked here, and it must have been able to click the login with that. Here it found welcome text. So everything was slightly off, but somehow it's able to make those clicks. And here you can see, over on this side, we can see the selectors, we can see the duration, we can see anything that's in the console. So if I do the go to here, looks like nothing was printing on the page. Let's take a look at the network tab. So you can see on the go to, see all these network requests. On the click, we get all these network requests, and then over here, there's not very much happening in the network from then on. So again, we can see this, and we can also see the before and after. So here's where we're at before, then we're going to click the sample text, and this is what we get as the after. And then you can again see what happens when we click here and what it looked like before that. It's interesting. You can see quite a bit. Then we can also go to the metadata with the viewport, pages, actions, and events. And then you can also see in your calls here what's going on. So if you're ever in a test and you get to somewhere and you're not sure what's going on, you can see where you got stuck in here. You can see what selector you were waiting on and where it fails. So it's possible you don't want to see the traces, but you might want to capture the video in case one of your tests fails. Again, you can do on, off, or retain on failure. And all you really need to do is pass in this parameter of video and on. Let's go back and take a look at that. So again, here we have Pytest video on. We're going to run this. It's going to clear out our folder. And then now in our folder, you can just see that there's 2 video files. So if I just want to open that folder, and then you can see what happened during the test. And this will record also during a headless test as well as headed test. So this works really good if you want to save off the videos on a CI server. All right, from here things get a little bit different, and I want to show you the documentation so you can go look to see where you can find things. So if we start at the Playwright Dev website, you go here, you can choose Python, you go to Docs. So the first thing I want to show you is actually that there's a version here, so you can see a specific version that you're using. Right now the latest is 1.19, but then you can also see next here. Across the side what you'll see is there's actually a release notes here. And then you can see as they're releasing, they're also putting their release notes here, so you can always find the latest features. Here you can see they've added a page locator that you can also use a locator and then has a locator of highlight and then click it. So some of that's interesting. You can see that they've had some API testing here, so you can do page request get. So if you wanted to pull back from a JSON and then use some of that test data in your test, you could do that. They have these web first assertions allowing you to look for something on the page to have text. And they also have some locator improvements like li has text. So there's a lot of different things out here that you can come find. It's also cool to go out and look at like the JavaScript ones and just kind of see what's coming out. And you can see here they have soft expectations. So there's just different things on different frameworks. So sometimes it's good to compare. Coming back over to the Python ones, the next thing I want to show you is everything we went through. You can find kind of in this getting started, the trace viewer, the test generator, debugging, and the Python. So one really cool thing is if you actually go to the Playwright Pytest repo and go to this Pytest Playwright.py, this is actually what's doing all the magic behind the scenes. This is what's generating our tests. This is what's doing the configuration. And this is what's actually running all the parameters. If I scroll down to the bottom here, you can see this is where it's grabbing what it does if traces are on or off. So if you want to follow this code or look at making improvements to how Pytest handles some scenarios, you can take a look here. You can see how they're telling if it's Firefox, if it's Chromium. If you want to do something specific in your test on a specific browser, you can use those types of things. And then these are fixtures for Pytest that are reusable, and you can kind of just build up what you want. We talked about the auto waits and API testing a little bit. One cool thing you can do is if you have to log into your page and you don't want to log in constantly, you can save off logging. So if you look here, it's possible to use context, storage state, and then a JSON file. If you look in the test generator file, preserve authenticated state, you can see how to use Codegen to save the storage state. And if you go through, you log into your file, and then when you close the generator, it'll save off that auth JSON here for you. So then when you start your test, all you have to do that is with the load storage. It's pretty easy to load this up when your app starts. You use that as your login. We didn't talk about browser context, but a browser is the like Firefox, Chrome, or WebKit. And each browser has multiple contexts, and each context has multiple pages. And all that's getting managed by Pytest for us. But if you're doing something where you need to talk to multiple pages, what you probably want is one context that has 2 pages in it, because the browser's the heavy thing. You never want 2 browsers unless you're talking to a Google browser and a Firefox browser. The browser is like the super heavyweight, so the page is the lightest weight one you can get. You probably want to be working with pages. That's really if you've got something that's specific that needs multiple contexts. And you can come back out here and take a look at how these work. Most people can just skip those and use the pages you're given inside of Pytest. Playwright does its best to handle dialogues for you. You can see that it can interact with alerts, prompts, and different settings. There's some downloads and emulation. If you're doing some geographic location settings, you can emulate those or emulate different devices. If you're super crazy and you want to evaluate custom JavaScript, you can do that here too. Fetch a response and return the status, or just run any of these kind of situations that they have out there. Playwright also exposes all the events in your browser, so you can wait for specific events, mock certain events. You can do all kinds of different listeners. Playwright can handle iframes, so if you're stuck using iframes, you can actually use multiple frames. So you can look for frames using specific attributes or URLs. So this is an area that you might need to use if you're stuck using iframes. In navigations, there's a lot of information out here, but one of the real cool things is you can do a wait until. So when you go to a URL, you can actually do a go-to that says wait until network's idle. If you're using Angular or React, you might want to use this, because sometimes it makes a whole bunch of network requests and you might have to wait for like 10 or 15 seconds for your page to load, especially if you're doing something with a corporate website that just doesn't handle very good in a demo environment. So I've used this before, this wait until network's idle. That kind of gets you stable until all your frameworks are loaded, and then Playwright can work a lot better. And then sometimes a certain page will load where it's just helpful to know that this exists. This is where you can... This section talks about the network proxies and ignoring HTTPS. You can come out here and take a look if you need to do any of that kind of stuff. I'm not going to jump too much into pages and page object models. This is really just if you're handling multiples or pop-ups or something, it'll give you some direction there. Page objects models have nothing to do with Playwright. That's just how you can reuse code in unit tests, and the same goes for if doing these Playwright tests. It simplifies authoring by letting you reuse like a higher level API. If you guys want to know more about that, comment down below. Playwright also includes a screenshot API, where you can take a screenshot of an element or the whole page like this. We talked about videos, but the other cool thing you can do here, besides specifying a video, is specifying the size of the video. And you can also do things if you want to do some post-processing, you can grab the path that the video is going to go to. So just finishing up really quick, there are some integrations for continuous integration, Docker, and Selenium Grid. You can go out there and try those on your own. At this point, I want to thank you for watching. If you want to see more Playwright content, subscribe. See you guys in the next video.